Sometimes a child belongs somewhere, but the world tells them they don't. Sometimes the people who should welcome them turn them away instead. Thorbjorn the Giant brought a girl to the feast that no one wanted there. The Jarl's family called her a thrall and said she had no right to sit with noble blood. For 20 years, this old warrior had kept quiet about who she really was. But that night by the fire, he finally told the truth. He spoke of a hidden birth during a raid and a shieldmaiden who died protecting her daughter. He revealed a secret that would change everything they thought they knew about family and honor. The girl they rejected wasn't a stranger at all. What truth had this silent giant carried for 2 decades that would shake an entire clan to its core? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great longhouse of Jarl Einar stood like a mountain against the winter sky, its timber walls darkened by countless seasons of smoke and weather. Tonight, the massive hearth blazed with oak logs thick as a man's torso, casting dancing shadows across the carved beams that told stories of ancient victories. The air thrummed with conversation and the clatter of drinking horns, while the scent of roasted venison and honeyed mead filled every corner of the hall. This was no ordinary feast. After 3 generations of blood feuds with the clans of the eastern fjords, tonight marked the first gathering meant to forge lasting peace. Representatives from 5 neighboring clans had traveled through treacherous mountain passes to break bread under Einar's roof. The ceremonial peace blade, a sword of burnished steel with intricate silver inlay, lay across the high table as a symbol of the alliance they hoped to seal before winter's end. Jarl Einar himself commanded, respect from his carved oak chair, his grey beard braided with silver rings that caught the firelight. At 63 winters, he carried the weight of leadership in his weathered hands and the wisdom of hard-won battles in his pale blue eyes. The losses of recent years had carved deeper lines around those eyes. The death of his eldest son in a raid 2 summers past. The mysterious disappearance of his daughter Valdis 20 years ago. And the countless young warriors who would never return to their families. Beside him sat his wife Astrid, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, her green eyes sharp as winter ice as they surveyed the assembled guests. She wore her finest blue wool dress, fastened with the gold brooches that marked her status as the Jarl's wife. But those who knew her well could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the careful way she chose her words. Astrid had not lived through 45 winters by being careless with trust, especially when it came to protecting her family's position. Their sons flanked the high table like young wolves eager to prove themselves. Ragnar, the elder at 28, possessed his father's broad shoulders and commanding presence, though his amber eyes held a restlessness that spoke of ambitions not yet fulfilled. His younger brother Olaf, 25 and lean as a hunting hound, compensated for his slighter build with a quick wit and quicker temper. Both young men understood that this feast represented more than diplomacy. It was their chance to demonstrate worthiness to inherit their father's legacy. The hall itself told the story of their lineage through every carved post and painted shield that adorned the walls. Scenes of great hunts, legendary battles, and the deeds of ancestors stretched back through generations, reminding all who entered of the blood and honor that built this house. The benches were filled with clan members, visiting dignitaries and trusted warriors, their voices creating a steady rumble of conversation, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional clash of drinking horns in toast. But it was the man standing quietly near the great doors who drew the most curious glances, though few dared to stare openly. Thorbjorn the Giant towered above every other soul in the hall, his massive frame cloaked in a simple brown wool tunic that had seen many years of faithful service. His greying beard hung to his chest, and his hands, scarred from decades of wielding sword and axe, rested calmly at his sides. Most remarkable of all was his silence. For 20 years, Thorbjorn had served as Jarl Einar's most trusted warrior and closest friend, yet he spoke perhaps a dozen words on any given day. Some said a curse had stolen his voice during a distant battle. Others whispered that he had taken a sacred vow of silence after witnessing some terrible deed. The truth was simpler and more mysterious. Thorbjorn chose his words as carefully as a master craftsman chooses each strike of his hammer. And when he did speak, men listened. Tonight, however, something was different about the giant warrior. Where he usually stood alone, content to observe from the shadows, he had positioned himself beside a young woman who clearly did not belong among the assembled nobility. Sigrid appeared to be perhaps 19 or 20 winters old, with the kind of quiet beauty that revealed itself slowly, like dawn breaking over still water. Her dark hair hung in a simple braid down her back, unmarked by the elaborate pins and ribbons that adorned the other women present. Her dress was clean but plain, good wool dyed a deep brown, with simple bone buttons instead of silver clasps. She wore no jewelry, save for a small wooden pendant at her throat, carved with symbols too worn to read clearly. What struck observers most was not her modest appearance, but the way she carried herself. Despite her humble clothing, Sigrid moved with an unconscious grace that spoke of noble bearing. Her posture was straight without being rigid, her gestures measured without being calculated. When she listened to the conversations around her, she did so with the kind of focused attention that suggested intelligence and genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Yet she remained apart from the festivities, neither joining the women's conversations about weaving and harvest preparations, nor mingling with the younger guests who clustered near the fire sharing stories and songs. Instead, she stood beside Thorbjorn like a shadow, accepted but not welcomed, present but not included. The feast had been in progress for nearly an hour when Astrid first noticed the girl's presence. The Jarl's wife possessed the kind of sharp awareness that came from years of managing household politics and watching for threats to her family's interests. Her gaze settled on Sigrid with the calculating coldness of a hawk spotting prey. "Who is that creature standing beside Thorbjorn?" she murmured to her eldest son, her voice pitched low enough to avoid carrying beyond the high table. Ragnar followed his mother's gaze and shrugged dismissively. "Some serving girl he brought along, perhaps. You know how he collects strays, wounded birds and lost lambs. Though why he would bring one to a feast of this importance, she doesn't dress like a servant," Olaf interjected, leaning closer to study Sigrid's appearance. "Look at the way she holds herself. There's breeding there, even if the bloodline is common." Astrid's eyes narrowed as she watched Thorbjorn place a protective hand on Sigrid's shoulder when a drunken guest stumbled too close. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. The giant warrior was claiming responsibility for the girl's presence and safety. This was no casual arrangement. "Find out who she is," Astrid commanded quietly, "and why Thorbjorn thinks he can bring unknown blood to our table without permission." The directive rippled. Outward as servants and lesser family members began to inquire discreetly about the mysterious young woman. But their questions met with frustrated silence. No one seemed to know her name, her origin, or her connection to Thorbjorn. She had simply appeared at his side as they entered the hall, as if she had materialized from the winter mist itself. Meanwhile, Jarl Einar found his attention repeatedly drawn to the girl, despite his efforts to focus on the diplomatic conversations swirling around him. Something about her stirred memories he couldn't quite grasp. A familiar tilt of the head, perhaps, or the particular shade of her dark hair. The sensation was like trying to recall a half-remembered dream, always slipping away, just as clarity seemed within reach. The political undercurrents of the feast continued to ebb and flow around these personal mysteries. Representatives from the eastern clans spoke carefully about trade routes and mutual defense pacts, while their hosts responded with equal caution. Trust was a precious commodity that could not be dispensed freely, especially when old wounds remained tender and memories of betrayal still burned bright. But even as diplomats negotiated and warriors boasted of past glories, eyes kept returning to the unlikely pair near the great doors. Thorbjorn the Giant, whose loyalty to the Jarl's family was legendary and absolute, standing guard over a nameless girl who had no apparent right to be there. The contradiction was magnetic, drawing curiosity like iron draws lodestone. As the evening deepened and the mead flowed more freely, tongues began to loosen and speculations grew bolder. Some guests whispered that Sigrid might be Thorbjorn's daughter by some forgotten woman, though the giant warrior had never shown interest in marriage or family. Others suggested she was a hostage from a conquered clan, held as surety for good behavior, but none of these theories could explain the careful way Thorbjorn watched over her, or the dignity with which she bore the curious stares and whispered comments. There was a story here, a secret that ran deeper than surface appearances suggested. And in a hall full of warriors and politicians, the promise of hidden truth was as intoxicating as the strongest mead. The carved beams overhead seemed to lean closer, as if the very structure of the longhouse was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would break and secrets would spill forth like blood from a severed artery. The peace blade gleamed on the high table, but tonight it seemed that a different kind of blade, the sharp edge of truth, might prove more dangerous to the carefully maintained order of things. In the flickering firelight, shadows danced and shifted, and the girl named Sigrid stood perfectly still, unaware that her very presence was about to shatter 20 years of carefully guarded silence and change. The fate of everyone in that hall forever. The moment that would change everything began with something as simple as thirst. Sigrid had stood quietly beside Thorbjorn for nearly 2 hours, watching the feast unfold around her like a careful observer at the edge of a great tapestry. The heat from the massive hearth and the press of so many bodies had left her throat dry, but she had not presumed to ask for refreshment. She was, after all, an uninvited guest in this hall of nobles and warriors. It was Thorbjorn who noticed her discomfort first. The giant warrior's pale eyes, sharp despite his advancing years, caught the slight way she swallowed and the careful manner in which she wet her lips. Without a word, he guided her forward through the crowd, toward the serving tables, where carved wooden cups and ornate drinking horns awaited the guests. The movement through the hall drew attention like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations paused as the unlikely pair made their way past clusters of feasting clan members. Thorbjorn's massive presence always commanded respect, but tonight there was something different in the way. People watched him, a curiosity mixed with concern. About the young woman at his side, they had nearly reached the serving area when Astrid's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade through. "Silk, stop!" The single word carried with it all the authority of her position as the Jarl's wife. Conversations died around them as guests turned to witness what was clearly becoming a confrontation. Even the servants paused in their duties, sensing the shift in the hall's atmosphere. Thorbjorn halted immediately, his hand moving instinctively to rest on Sigrid's shoulder in a gesture of protection. Sigrid herself straightened, but kept her eyes lowered, understanding, without being told, that she had somehow become the center of unwanted attention. Astrid rose from her place at the high table, her green eyes blazing with cold authority. The gold brooches at her shoulders caught the firelight as she descended from the raised platform, each step measured and deliberate. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried clearly across the now silent hall. "Before you take refreshment from our table, girl, perhaps you might tell us who you are and by what right you feast among noble blood." The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Sigrid lifted her head slowly, meeting Astrid's gaze with a steadiness that surprised many of the watching guests. When she spoke, her voice was clear and respectful, but without the servile tone that might have been expected. "I am called Sigrid, my lady. I came here at the invitation of Thorbjorn, whom I serve faithfully. I meant no offense by my presence." "Serve?" Astrid's eyebrows rose mockingly. "In what capacity does a girl of unknown blood serve our most trusted warrior? And what manner of service requires you to attend a feast meant for clan leaders and their honored guests?" A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. The implication in Astrid's tone was clear enough to make several of the younger men grin and exchange knowing glances. But Thorbjorn's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His massive frame tensed like a hunting cat, preparing to spring, and his weathered hand moved to the hilt of his eating knife. Sigrid, however, responded with a dignity that silenced the whispers as effectively as a shout might have. "I serve as companion and caretaker to one who has done great service to this house. If my presence offends, I will gladly withdraw." "You will withdraw when I tell you to withdraw," Astrid snapped, taking another step closer. "But first, you will answer properly. What is your lineage? Who are your parents? From which clan do you come?" The question struck like physical blows. Sigrid's composure wavered for the first time, and those watching closely could see the flash of old pain that crossed her features. I do not know my parents, my lady. I was raised by kind folk who found me as an infant. My bloodline is unknown to me." This admission sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the hall. In a society where lineage was everything, where a person's worth was measured by the deeds of their ancestors, to claim no knowledge of one's blood was tantamount to claiming no right to exist among respectable people. Ragnar and Olaf had moved to flank their mother, their faces showing a mixture of amusement and contempt. It was Ragnar who spoke next, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a young man secure in his own position. "Unknown blood, drinking from our cups? Mother, surely such presumption cannot be tolerated. If she has no lineage to claim, then she is no better than a thrall, and thralls do not sit at table with their betters." "Indeed," Olaf added, his tone equally dismissive. "Perhaps she should return to whatever hovel spawned her, and leave the feast to those who belong here by right of birth and honor." The words hit their mark. Sigrid's face flushed, but whether from shame or anger was difficult to tell. Several of the watching guests nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening as they looked at the young woman who had dared to aspire above her station. But it was in that moment, as the walls of hostility closed around Sigrid like a trap, that something changed in Thorbjorn the Giant. For 20 years, he had been the soul of restraint and measured response. Countless times he had absorbed insults, overlooked slights, and maintained his silence in the face of provocation. His legendary self-control had become as much a part of his reputation as his skill with weapons, or his unwavering loyalty to the Jarl's family. Now, watching the girl he had protected since birth being humiliated by the very people he had served faithfully for decades, something ancient and powerful stirred within him. The silver ring on his weathered finger, the ring that bound him to his oath of silence, seemed to burn against his skin like a brand. He looked down at Sigrid, seeing in her downcast eyes the echo of another face, another time, another promise made in desperate circumstances. The weight of 20 years of silence pressed against his chest like a physical burden, demanding release. When Thorbjorn finally spoke, his voice was like distant thunder rolling across a mountain valley, deep, resonant, and impossible to ignore. "Enough!" The single word carried such authority that even Astrid took an involuntary step backward. Conversations that had been building toward a crescendo of gossip and speculation died instantly. Every person in the hall turned to stare at the giant warrior, many of them hearing him speak more than a few words for the first time in their memory. Thorbjorn's pale eyes swept the assembly with the calm precision of a man accustomed to command. When he spoke again, his words fell into the silence like stones dropped into deep water. "This girl drinks from our cups by right of blood that runs truer than any in this hall. She sits among you not as a servant or a stray, but as one whose lineage reaches back to the very foundations of this house. You call her unknown, but I have known her since the night of her birth. You call her unworthy, but she carries the blood of heroes in her veins." The effect of this pronouncement was immediate and electric. Gasps arose from the assembled guests, and several people rose from their seats as if pulled upright by invisible strings. Astrid's face went pale, then flushed red with what might have been anger or fear. "You speak in riddles. Old friend," Jarl Einar said carefully, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of long leadership. "If this girl is known to you, if she carries blood you claim to recognize, then speak plainly. Who is she?" Thorbjorn looked down at Sigrid one more time. seeing in her upturned face the same courage that had marked her mother, the same quiet dignity that had cost one woman her life and condemned another to 20 years of exile. The silver ring on his finger seemed to loosen, as if the oath that had bound him was finally ready to release its hold. When he raised his head to address the hall, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "She is the daughter of your daughter, Jarl Einar. The child you thought lost forever walks among us still, bearing the blood of your blood, bone of your bone. This is Sigrid Valdisdottir, granddaughter of the Jarl, and I have protected her secret these 20 years as I swore to her dying mother I would." The silence that followed was so complete that the crackling of the great fire sounded like the breaking of entire worlds. The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring, taut with disbelief and shock. Then it shattered as voices erupted from every corner of the hall, some shouting denials, others demanding proof, and still others simply crying out in amazement at what they had witnessed. Impossible. Astrid's voice cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. "Valdis died 20 years ago, childless and unmarried. This is some madness brought on by age and too much mead." But even as she spoke, her eyes searched Thorbjorn's face for any sign of deception and found none. The giant warrior stood as solid as a mountain, his weathered features carved from stone, his pale eyes holding the absolute certainty of a man who had carried truth too long in silence. Jarl Einar had risen from his carved chair, his face pale as winter snow. His hands gripped the edge of the high table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Valdis," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. "My daughter, you speak of my Valdis." The name sent another ripple of murmurs through the assembled guests. Many remembered the Jarl's eldest daughter, a spirited girl with dark hair and flashing eyes, who had vanished one autumn night without explanation. The official story had always been that she died in a riding accident, her body lost in the treacherous waters of the fjord. But there had been whispers, rumors of a secret love affair that had brought shame to the family. Thorbjorn reached into the leather pouch at his belt with deliberate slowness, aware that every eye in the hall was fixed upon his movements. What he withdrew made several women gasp and caused Jarl Einar to stagger backward as if struck. It was half of a silver brooch, intricately worked with the flowing designs that marked the finest craftsmanship. The piece had been broken cleanly down the middle, leaving jagged edges that spoke of violence or desperate haste. But what remained was unmistakably part of a larger whole, a piece that many in the hall recognized. "I kept this these 20 years, Thorbjorn said, his deep voice carrying easily across the hushed assembly. "The other half lies with Valdis in her grave, placed there by my own hands as she breathed her last. She pressed this into my palm as her daughter drew her first breath, and made me swear by all the gods that I would keep the child safe until the day came when truth could be spoken, without bringing death upon innocent heads." Astrid's face had gone from pale to ashen. Anyone could have stolen that brooch. Anyone could have... Could they? Thorbjorn's interruption was gentle but implacable. He held the broken silver up to the firelight, and the intricate patterns caught and reflected the flames. "Look closely, all of you who remember. See the unique markings that Hakon the smith wrought with his own hands. See the tiny rune carved in the corner, Valdis's personal mark, known only to her family." Several of the older guests leaned forward, squinting at the artifact in the dancing light. Gradually, nods of recognition began to spread through the crowd. The brooch was, indeed, Valdis's, there could be no doubt, but it was Jarl Einar's reaction that convinced even the most skeptical observers. The old warrior's legs gave way, and he sank back into his chair as if all the strength had fled from his body. His eyes, fixed on the broken silver, filled with a mixture of grief and desperate hope. "She wore that brooch the last time I saw her," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The night she left us, I thought it went to the bottom of the fjord with her body." "There was no riding accident," Thorbjorn said gently, his tone carrying the weight of long-held sorrow. No body lost to the waters. Valdis lived, Jarl Einar. She lived long enough to bring this child into the world, and long enough to make me promise that her daughter would know safety even if she could never know her true heritage. Sigrid had remained silent through this exchange, her face a mask of stunned bewilderment. The revelation that she was the granddaughter of the Jarl, that the mysterious parents she had wondered about her entire life included the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the region, left her reeling. But it was the mention of her mother's name that broke through her shock. Valdis, she whispered, testing the name on her tongue like a prayer. My mother's name was Valdis. The sound of her voice speaking that beloved name seemed to reach Jarl Einar like a physical blow. He looked at her for the first time, not as an unwelcome stranger, but as someone whose features might hold echoes of a daughter he had mourned for 20 years. And the echoes were there. Once he knew to look for them. The shape of her eyes, the particular way she held her head when listening intently, the graceful movements that spoke of noble breeding despite her humble attire. All of these carried whispers of Valdis in their lines. The shape of her face, he murmured, rising unsteadily from his chair. The way she stands. By all the gods, Thorbjorn, she has Valdis's look about her. But Ragnar and Olaf were not prepared to accept this transformation of their world without a fight. The brothers had moved to flank their mother, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm as they began to understand what this revelation might mean for their own positions. A piece of broken silver proves nothing, Ragnar declared, his voice carrying the harsh edge of desperation disguised as certainty. Any clever thief could have taken that brooch from our sister's body. Any cunning plotter could have crafted this deception to advance some hidden purpose. Indeed, Olaf added, his tone equally sharp. Why would Thorbjorn keep such a secret for 20 years? Why speak now at this moment, unless there is some advantage to be gained? Perhaps our enemies have finally found a way to place a false heir in our midst. Their words found fertile ground among some of the assembled guests, particularly those who had their own reasons to fear any disruption of the established order. Murmurs of agreement began to rise from various corners of the hall, and more than one hand moved instinctively toward a weapon, but Thorbjorn had not exhausted his store of evidence. Reaching again into his leather pouch, he withdrew a second object, this one small and worn, carved from dark wood and polished smooth by decades of handling. You ask why I kept silent for 20 years, he said, holding the wooden token so that all could see. Because Valdis made me swear by the ancient laws that I would speak only when speaking would bring safety rather than death. Because there were those who would have killed both mother and child to prevent the truth from emerging. Because the child's father was not just any man, but the son of our greatest enemy, and that knowledge would have meant war for both our clans. This revelation sent a fresh wave of shock through the assembly. A forbidden love affair was one thing. Such scandals, while serious, could be weathered. But an alliance with an enemy clan, a child born of that union, raised stakes that went far beyond family honor into the realm of politics and survival. Thorbjorn held up the wooden token, its carved surface catching the firelight. This is a birth rune, carved the night Valdis's daughter entered the world. It bears protective symbols from both our clan and that of her father, marking her as a bridge between two peoples who have spilled too much blood in pointless conflict. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, visible to all and impossible to ignore. The wooden token passed from hand to hand among the assembled guests, each person examining the intricate runes carved into its surface with growing amazement. Even those who could not read the ancient symbols could sense the power they represented, protective magic woven into wood by skilled hands, blessed by the gods of two different clans in a desperate attempt to shield an innocent child from the sins of her parents. Thorbjorn watched the examination with the patience of a man who had waited 20 years to reveal his burden. When the token was finally returned to him, He cradled it gently in his massive palms before speaking again. "The runes tell a story for those who can read them," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "They speak of a child born under the new moon, marked by both the ravens of our clan and the wolves of the eastern fjords. They name her father as Eric Gunnarsson, eldest son of Gunnar the Wolf King, our sworn enemy these past 30 years. A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. Gunnar the Wolf King was a name that carried fear and respect in equal measure throughout the northern lands. His raids had cost the lives of countless warriors from Jarl Einar's clan, and the blood feud between their peoples had become the stuff of legend. Yet here was evidence that the children of these warring houses had found love despite the hatred of their fathers, and that their union had produced the young woman who now stood trembling in the firelight, overwhelmed by revelations that were reshaping her entire understanding of herself. "You speak of events from 20 years past," Astrid said, her voice sharp with desperation disguised as skepticism. "How can we know these tales are true? How can we trust memories clouded by time and wishful thinking?" But even as she spoke, her husband was moving with the careful steps of a man afraid he might be dreaming. Jarl Einar descended from the high table and approached Sigrid with the reverence one might show a ghost returned from the dead. "Let me look at you, child," he said softly, his weathered hands reaching toward her face before stopping just short of contact. "Let me see if I can find my daughter in your features." Sigrid stood perfectly still as the old warrior studied her face in the dancing firelight. His eyes traced the line of her jaw, the shape of her nose, the particular shade of her dark hair. With each moment that passed, his expression grew more amazed and more certain. "The eyes," he whispered. "She has her grandmother's eyes, my beloved Helga's eyes, and the way she tilts her head when she listens, just as Valdis did as a child." His voice broke on the name. "By all the gods, Thorbjorn speaks truly. This is my daughter's daughter." The confirmation from Jarl Einar himself sent another wave of murmurs through the assembly. But Thorbjorn was not finished with his revelations. Reaching once more into his leather pouch, he withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "I have carried more than tokens and memories these 20 years, he said, as he carefully unwrapped the bundle. "I have carried Valdis's own words, written in her hand during the months before her death." What emerged from the cloth were several pieces of parchment, their surfaces covered with the flowing script that marked an educated hand. The mere existence of such writings was remarkable. Parchment was precious, and literacy among women, while not unknown, was far from common. Thorbjorn held the letters with the reverence due to sacred relics. Valdis wrote these during her exile, when she knew her time was growing short. She wanted her daughter to know the truth of her parentage, the reason for her sacrifice, and the love that brought her into being despite all obstacles. He selected one of the parchments and began to read in his deep, resonant voice. "My beloved daughter, whom I may never hold or comfort, know that you were conceived in love and born in hope. Your father, Eric of the Wolf Clan, is a man of honor who would have claimed you proudly had the world allowed it. But the hatred between our peoples runs too deep, and our love was a secret that could not survive in the harsh light of day." The words fell into the silent hall like drops of water into a still pool, creating ripples that spread to touch every listener. Even Astrid had gone quiet, her face pale, as she began to understand the implications of what was being revealed. Thorbjorn continued reading. "I have given you into the keeping of Thorbjorn the Giant, the most honorable man I've ever known. He has sworn to me by all the ancient oaths that he will guard you until the day comes when truth can be spoken without bringing death. Trust him as I have trusted him, for his word is as solid as mountain stone." Sigrid's composure finally cracked. Tears began to flow down her cheeks as she heard her mother's voice speaking across 20 years of silence. The woman who had been nothing more than a mystery, a void in her understanding of herself, was suddenly real, a person with thoughts and feelings, hopes and fears, sacrifices and love. "There is more," Thorbjorn said gently, selecting another parchment. She wrote of her love for your father and her hope that one day their union might bring peace instead of war. The second letter contained details that made several guests gasp in amazement. Valdis had not simply run away for a forbidden love affair. She had been conducting secret negotiations between the clans, using her relationship with Eric as a bridge toward ending the long feud. Her pregnancy had been both the culmination of their love and the ultimate barrier to their success. She died believing she had failed, Thorbjorn said, his voice heavy with old grief. She never knew that her sacrifice would one day provide the very bridge between our peoples that she had hoped to build in. Life. Ragnar and Olaf exchanged increasingly worried glances as they began to understand the full implications of these revelations. If Sigrid was truly Valdis's daughter, if she carried the blood of both clans, then she represented not just a threat to their inheritance, but a potential solution to conflicts that had shaped their entire lives. Even if these letters are genuine, Ragnar said desperately, even if this girl carries some portion of our blood, what changes? She was born in exile, raised in obscurity. She knows nothing of leadership, nothing of the responsibilities that come with noble blood. Perhaps, Thorbjorn replied calmly, but she carries within her the possibility of ending a war that has cost both clans too many sons. She's the bridge her parents died trying to build, a living symbol that love can triumph over hatred, that peace is possible even between the most bitter enemies. His words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront the possibility that this humble girl might hold the key to reshaping their entire world. The atmosphere in the great hall had shifted like the tide changing direction. Where moments before there had been skepticism and outright denial, now there was a growing sense of wonder, mixed with uncertainty. The evidence Thorbjorn had presented was mounting like stones in a cairn, each piece supporting the others until the structure became undeniable. But Astrid was not a woman to surrender without exhausting every weapon in her arsenal. Her sharp mind, honed by decades of political maneuvering, seized upon the one element that might still serve her purposes. Letters can be forged, she declared, her voice carrying across the hall with desperate authority. Parchment can be aged with smoke and weather. Even if these writings appear genuine, how can we know they truly came from Valdis's hand? How can we trust words that conveniently support this elaborate deception? Her challenge found some support among the assembled guests, particularly those whose own positions might be threatened by any disruption of the established order. Murmurs of agreement began to rise from various corners of the hall, and several pairs of eyes turned toward Thorbjorn with renewed suspicion. The giant warrior met their doubts with the calm patience of a man who had anticipated every objection. Without speaking, he reached into his leather pouch one final time and withdrew something that made Jarl Einar cry out as if he had been struck. It was another letter, but this one was different from the others. The parchment was finer, marked with the distinctive watermarks that indicated its origin in the scriptoriums of the great monasteries. More importantly, it bore a seal at the bottom, not pressed in wax, which could be counterfeited, but embossed directly into the parchment itself with a signet ring that many in the hall recognized. This letter bears Valdis's personal seal, Thorbjorn said, holding the parchment so that all could see the distinctive mark. The seal was made with the ring Jarl Einar gave her on her 16th birthday, the ring she wore until the day she died, and which now rests upon her finger in her grave. The signet ring had been unique, crafted by the finest jewelers and bearing symbols that were known only to the immediate family. Its impression in the parchment was clear and unmistakable, showing details that would have been impossible to forge without access to the original ring itself. Jarl Einar's face had gone white as winter snow. That ring, I had it made specially for her. No other like it exists in all the world. His voice dropped to a whisper. She wore it always, said it reminded her that she carried my love wherever she might go. With trembling hands, Thorbjorn unfolded the final letter and began to read in his deep, in measured voice, to my beloved father, Jarl Einar. Though you may never read these words in this life, I write to you from my place of exile, heavy with child and heavy with sorrow for the pain my choices have brought to our house. You will think me dead, and perhaps that is for the best, for I can never return to the life I once knew. The words fell into absolute silence. Even the crackling of the great fire seemed muted as Valdis's voice reached across 20 years to touch her father's heart once more. I do not ask for forgiveness, for I know my actions have brought shame upon our name. But I ask that you remember the love we shared in happier times, and know that every choice I made was guided by a hope for peace between our peoples. Erik Gunnarsson is not the monster our tales have made him. He is a man of honor who loved me truly, and who would have claimed our child proudly had the world allowed it. Thorbjorn paused, allowing the impact of those words to settle before continuing. The child I carry will be born with the blood of both our houses flowing in her veins. She will be a bridge between our peoples, if wisdom prevails over hatred. I entrust her to Thorbjorn the Giant, whose loyalty and honor surpass that of any man I have known. He has sworn to protect her until the day comes when truth can be spoken without, bringing death to the innocent. Several of the assembled guests were wiping tears from their eyes as they listened to the dead woman's words. The love between father and daughter was evident in every line, as was the terrible burden of choices that had torn them apart. There is one thing more, Thorbjorn said, his voice growing softer as he neared the letter's end. A message meant specifically for the day when these words would finally be heard. He cleared his throat before reading the final passage. If my daughter lives to hear these words, know that she carries within her the power to heal old wounds and forge new bonds. She's not a bastard born of shame, but a child conceived in hope and born in love. Her father's clan knows nothing of her existence, for I chose exile rather than risk war. But perhaps the day will come when she can claim both her heritages and use them to build the peace that Erik and I died dreaming of. The letter's conclusion left the hall in profound silence. Even Astrid seemed stunned by the emotional weight of Valdis's words and the clear evidence of their authenticity, but it was the reaction of the assembled clan representatives that proved most significant. These men and women had lived through decades of raids and counter-raids, of young warriors lost to pointless feuding, of families torn apart by ancient hatreds. The possibility of peace, real, lasting peace, was something they had barely dared to imagine. One of the visiting dignitaries, an elderly warrior named Magnus, who bore scars from countless battles with the Wolf clan, rose slowly from his seat. If what we have heard tonight is true, he said, his weathered voice carrying clearly across the hall, then this girl represents something more precious than silver or gold. She is hope made flesh, the possibility that our children might grow to old age without the shadow of war hanging over them. His words seemed to unlock something in the assembly. Other voices began to join his, sharing their own losses, their own weariness with the endless cycle of violence that had defined their lives. My son died in a raid against the Wolf clan 3 summers ago, called out another guest. If this child can prevent other fathers from burying their boys, then she has my support. Whatever blood she carries, and mine, added a woman whose own losses were written in the lines of grief around her eyes. We have spilled enough blood in the name of old grudges. Perhaps it is time to try the path of peace. The tide of opinion in the hall was turning, but Ragnar and Olaf could see their own positions crumbling with each word of support for their newfound sister. The inheritance they had always assumed would be theirs was suddenly in question, and with it their entire future. But even they could not deny the power of what they had witnessed, the unshakable evidence of Sigrid's parentage and the growing recognition that she might indeed hold the key to ending a conflict that had shaped their entire world. The momentum of revelation continued to build like a gathering storm. Thorbjorn, having presented his evidence of Valdis's identity and motivations, now reached into the depths of his leather pouch for what would prove to be the most politically significant artifact of all. What he withdrew made several of the assembled guests gasp in recognition and fear. It was a ring, not the simple silver band that had bound him to silence, but an ornate piece of craftsmanship that bore the unmistakable markings of the Wolf clan. The gold band was worked with intricate knotwork, and at its center sat a carved wolf's head with eyes of polished amber. This belonged to Erik Gunnarsson, Thorbjorn announced, holding the ring so that all could see. He gave it to Valdis as a pledge of their secret marriage, performed by a wandering priest who asked no questions about clan loyalties or family feuds. The implications of this revelation rippled through the hall like waves from a stone thrown into still water. A secret marriage meant that Sigrid was not a bastard born of shame, but a legitimate child of two noble bloodlines. More than that, it meant she had a legal claim not only to her grandfather's heritage, but potentially to her father's as well. Magnus, the battle-scarred warrior, leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the ring with the intensity of a man who had spent his life studying enemy heraldry. "That is indeed the signet of the Wolf clan's heir," he confirmed grimly. "I have seen its mark on countless raids and treaties these past 30 years. There can be no doubt of its authenticity." Astrid's face had gone beyond pale to a sickly grey color. The political ramifications of what was being revealed were staggering. If Sigrid carried legitimate claims to both clans, she represented not just a threat to her son's inheritance, but a potential reorganization of power throughout the entire region. "Even if she carries blood from both houses," Astrid said desperately, "what does it matter? Her father's clan knows nothing of her existence. She has no allies among the wolf people, no support from that quarter. She's alone and friendless, whatever rings and letters might say about her parentage." But Thorbjorn's weathered features showed the faint suggestion of a smile, the first such expression many had seen from him in years. "That is where you are mistaken, Lady Astrid," he said quietly. Erik Gunnarsson did not die ignorant of his daughter's fate. Before Valdis breathed her last, she sent word to him of the child's birth and her own impending death. She wanted him to know that their love had created something beautiful, even if that beauty must remain hidden for a time. This revelation sent another shock through the assembly. The idea that the Wolf clan's heir had known about Sigrid all along changed everything about the political calculations surrounding her existence. "You mean to tell us," Jarl Einar said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding, "that our greatest enemy has a daughter he has never claimed, living under our very protection?" "Indeed," Thorbjorn replied, "and more than that, Erik Gunnarsson has watched over her from afar these 20 years, just as I have watched over her from close at hand. He has never ceased hoping for the day when she could be acknowledged safely, when the peace her parents dreamed of might finally become reality." The old warrior reached into his pouch one final time and withdrew a small scroll, its parchment bearing the distinctive red wax seal of the Wolf clan. This arrived by Raven 3 days ago, as if Erik somehow knew that the time for revelation was at hand. He broke the seal carefully and unrolled the parchment, revealing text written in the bold hand of a warrior accustomed to command. "To Thorbjorn the Giant, faithful guardian of my heart's greatest treasure," he read aloud. "The time has come to end the silence that has kept our peoples bleeding for too long. My daughter has grown to womanhood under your protection, and for that service I am forever in your debt. When she is ready to claim her heritage from both our houses, she will find the Wolf clan prepared to welcome her with the honor due to our blood." The letter continued with specific details that proved Erik's intimate knowledge of Sigrid's upbringing and development. He knew of her kindness to animals, her skill with healing herbs, her quiet wisdom that impressed all who came to know her. These were not the observations of a distant stranger, but the careful attention of a father who had watched his child grow despite being unable to claim her openly. "The feud between our clans," the letter concluded, "was born of pride and sustained by stubbornness. It has cost us both too much, sons and daughters, fathers and mothers, dreams and hopes. If my daughter can be the bridge to peace that her mother died believing was possible, then every sacrifice will have meaning at last." The impact of these words on the assembled guests was profound. Here was proof that the Wolf Clan's leadership was not only aware of Sigrid's existence, but actively hoped for the peace she might bring. The endless cycle of raids and revenge that had defined their lives suddenly seemed not inevitable, but changeable. Ragnar and Olaf exchanged looks of growing desperation. The inheritance they had assumed would be theirs was slipping away with each revelation. But worse than that was the growing realization that their resistance to Sigrid's recognition was placing them on the wrong side of history. "This changes everything," Ragnar said quietly, his voice carrying a note of defeat. "If the Wolf Clan acknowledges her, if they seek peace through her, then we must consider what is best for all our people," Jarl Einar interrupted, his voice growing stronger as he began to grasp the full implications of what had been revealed. "Not what serves our pride or our personal ambitions, but what serves the greater good." The old Jarl looked at Sigrid with new eyes, not as an unwelcome disruption to his family's peace, but as a gift that might heal wounds that had festered for far too long. In her quiet dignity, her graceful bearing despite the shock of these revelations, he saw echoes of the daughter he had lost, and hope for a future he had never dared to imagine. "My granddaughter," he said softly, the words carrying across the silent hall like a blessing. "Sigrid Valdisdottir, daughter of two houses, bridge between enemies, hope for peace. You are welcome in this hall not as a stranger seeking charity, but as family coming home at last." The formal recognition sent a final wave of murmurs through the assembly, but these were no longer sounds of doubt or denial. They were the voices of people beginning to believe that change, real, a fundamental change, might finally be possible. The moment of triumph, of family recognition and the promise of peace, hung in the air like the calm before a violent storm. Jarl Einar had risen from his chair, his arms extended toward the granddaughter he had never known existed, and the assembled guests had begun to murmur their approval of this miraculous reunion. But Astrid had not survived decades of political maneuvering by accepting defeat gracefully. "How touching," she said, her voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere like a blade through silk. "How very convenient that all these revelations should come to light now, at this precise moment, when our clan stands on the brink of making peace with our ancient enemies." Her words carried an undertone that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. There was something in her tone, a cold calculation that suggested she was far from finished with this confrontation. "What do you mean, wife?" Jarl Einar asked, though there was a growing wariness in his voice. He had been married to Astrid for 25 years, and he knew the particular tone she used when she was preparing to strike a killing blow. Astrid moved with predatory grace toward the center of the hall, her green eyes fixed on Thorbjorn with an intensity that made the giant warrior tense visibly. "I mean that perhaps we should ask ourselves why our most trusted friend chose this moment to break his 20 years of silence. Why tonight? Why now? What has changed that makes these revelations suddenly safe to speak?" The questions hung in the air, and several guests began to nod thoughtfully. The timing was indeed curious, and Astrid's implications were clear, that Thorbjorn might be acting not from noble motives, but from some hidden agenda. "Perhaps," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she sensed doubt beginning to creep back into the assembly, "we should consider the possibility that this entire performance has been orchestrated for reasons that have nothing to do with family reunions or ancient love stories." Thorbjorn's face had gone still as granite, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something that might have been alarm. "What are you suggesting, Lady Astrid?" "I am suggesting that 20 years is a very long time to carry such momentous secrets. Long enough for those secrets to ferment, to change, to become weapons rather than truths." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her next blow. "Long enough for a man to grow resentful of his masters, perhaps. long enough to plan revenge for slights, both real and imagined. The accusation was subtle but devastating. She was suggesting that Thorbjorn's revelations were not driven by loyalty to a dying woman's wishes, but by some personal grudge against the family he had served so faithfully. But Astrid was far from finished. Moving toward the high table, she reached for something that had been sitting there throughout the feast, unnoticed among the ceremonial vessels and serving pieces. It was a drinking horn, ornately carved and inlaid with silver, one of the finest pieces in the hall. "This horn," she said, holding it up to the firelight, "has been at my husband's place at every feast for the past 3 years. It was a gift from a visiting chieftain, crafted by the finest artisans in the southern kingdoms." She paused, running her finger along the horn's polished surface. "It is also, I have recently discovered, the delivery method for a slow-acting poison that has been gradually destroying my husband's health and clouding his judgment." The revelation hit the assembly like a physical blow. Gasps arose from every corner of the hall, and several guests rose from their seats in alarm. Jarl Einar himself staggered backward, his hand moving instinctively to his throat. "Poison," he whispered, his face pale with shock and growing understanding. "But how could... The poison is extracted from the bark of the deathcap tree," Astrid continued relentlessly. "Administered in tiny doses over months or years, it causes gradual weakness, confusion, and eventual death. The victim rarely suspects anything more than the natural effects of aging until it is far too late." She turned to face Thorbjorn directly, her eyes blazing with triumph. "And who, I ask you all, has had access to my husband's food and drink at every meal for the past 20 years? Who has stood guard over him, ostensibly protecting him, while slowly murdering him with calculated precision?" The accusation was so shocking, so completely unexpected, that for a moment no one in the hall seemed capable of speech. Thorbjorn the Giant, the most loyal and trusted of warriors, being accused of slowly poisoning his lord. It was almost too monstrous to comprehend. But Astrid was not relying solely on accusation. From beneath her dress, she withdrew a small vial filled with dark liquid. "This was found hidden in Thorbjorn's quarters," she announced. "The same poison that has been slowly killing my husband, stored where only the would-be murderer could access it." Thorbjorn's face had gone white as winter snow. "That is not mine," he said, his voice hoarse with shock. "I have never seen that vial before this moment. Someone has placed it there to what?" Astrid interrupted. "To frame an innocent man? How convenient that the same person who brings us this elaborate tale of hidden heirs and secret marriages should suddenly be revealed as a traitor and murderer." The tide of opinion in the hall began to shift once again, but this time away from Thorbjorn and Sigrid. The evidence of poisoning was physical, immediate, and terrifying in its implications. If Thorbjorn could betray his oath so completely, what else might he be capable of? "There is more," Astrid continued, pressing her advantage. "I have reason to believe that the girl he calls Valdis's daughter is actually a plant, a carefully trained agent placed here to disrupt our family and weaken our position before the coming negotiations with the wolf clan." She gestured towards Sigrid, who stood frozen in shock at the rapid reversal of her fortunes. "Consider how perfectly she fits the role. Beautiful enough to gain sympathy, humble enough to seem harmless, but educated enough to have been trained for this very purpose. And how convenient that all the evidence of her parentage comes from the very man who has been slowly murdering her supposed grandfather." The accusations were devastating in their scope and complexity. Astrid was not merely challenging Sigrid's identity, she was painting both her and Thorbjorn as part of an elaborate conspiracy against the clan. But it was Sigrid herself who provided the moment that began to turn the tide back in their favor. Instead of cowering under the accusations or protesting her innocence, she stepped forward with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the evening. "Lady Astrid," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the chaos around her, "if I am truly an agent of some enemy conspiracy, then surely I would have been trained to respond to exactly this sort of accusation. A clever spy would have rehearsed protests of innocence, prepared explanations, perhaps even false evidence to support her claims. She paused, looking around the hall at the faces of people who had been ready to welcome her as family only moments before. But I have no such preparations because I am exactly what Thorbjorn says I am, a girl who knew nothing of her heritage until tonight, who is as shocked by these revelations as any of you. Her words carried the ring of truth, but more than that, they carried the wisdom of someone who understood the deeper implications of what was happening. If you wish to test whether I am who Thorbjorn claims, then test me. Ask me questions that only Valdis's daughter would know the answers to. Examine the evidence with fresh eyes, without the assumption that it must be false because the timing seems convenient. It was then that Jarl Einar, despite his shock at the accusations against his most trusted friend, made a decision that would prove crucial. "Bring me the horn," he commanded, his voice still weak but carrying the authority of long leadership. When the allegedly poisoned vessel was placed in his hands, he examined it carefully, running his weathered fingers over every inch of its surface. What he found made his expression grow grim. "This horn shows signs of tampering," he announced. Tiny holes drilled in the base and filled with wax, creating chambers where poison could be stored and slowly released. He looked up at his wife with growing suspicion. "But these modifications are recent, Astrid. The wax is still soft, the drill marks fresh. This poisoning began not years ago, but days ago at most." The revelation turned Astrid's accusations back upon herself, and suddenly the whole began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy they were witnessing. The revelation that the poisoned horn showed signs of recent tampering sent a ripple of shock through the assembled guests that was even more profound than Thorbjorn's earlier disclosures. The implications were staggering. If Astrid had been attempting to poison her own husband while framing Thorbjorn for the crime, then everything they thought they knew about the evening's events needed to be reconsidered. Jarl Einar continued his examination of the horn, his weathered hands moving with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades evaluating weapons and equipment for signs of tampering or weakness. What he found made his expression grow increasingly grim. "The wax filling these holes is so fresh it bears fingerprints," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall. "And unless my eyes deceive me, these are a woman's fingers, smaller and more delicate than a warrior's hands." All eyes turned to Astrid, whose face had gone from triumphant to pale in the space of a heartbeat. But she was not a woman to surrender easily, even when caught in her own trap. "Anyone could have tampered with that horn," she said, her voice sharp with desperation, disguised as indignation. "Perhaps Thorbjorn himself, seeking to cast suspicion away from his own crimes. Or perhaps the girl, demonstrating the very cunning I warned you about." But Thorbjorn had found his voice again, and when he spoke, it carried the weight of absolute truth that had marked all his earlier revelations. "There is a way to settle this matter once and for all," he said, his pale eyes fixed on Astrid with unwavering intensity. "Let us examine not just the horn, but the source of the poison itself. Let us discover where the death cap extract came from and who had access to it." The suggestion clearly alarmed Astrid, though she tried to hide her reaction behind a mask of righteous anger. "This is ridiculous. We are allowing ourselves to be distracted from the real issue, the questionable claims of this so-called granddaughter and the convenient timing of her appearance." But Magnus, the battle-scarred warrior, had risen from his seat, his expression thoughtful as he studied the interplay between the family members. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should indeed examine all the evidence before making any final judgments. The stakes here are too high for hasty decisions." He gestured toward the assembled artifacts that Thorbjorn had presented throughout the evening. "We have seen the broken brooch, the birth rune, the letters bearing Valdis's seal, and the wedding ring of Eric Gunnarsson. Each piece supports the others, creating a pattern of evidence that would be difficult to fabricate." Another guest, a wise woman named Ragnhild, whose counsel was respected throughout the region, nodded her agreement. Moreover, we have seen the girl's own behavior throughout these revelations. She has shown none of the calculation or preparation one would expect from a trained deceiver. Her reactions have been those of someone learning shocking truths about herself for the first time. The tide of opinion was beginning to turn once more, but Astrid was not finished with her desperate gambit. From the folds of her dress, she withdrew another small object, a piece of parchment that appeared to be a letter. "Since we are examining evidence," she said, her voice taking on a tone of grim satisfaction, "perhaps we should consider this missive, which arrived by Raven just yesterday. It concerns our so-called granddaughter and her true purpose here." She unfolded the parchment with theatrical precision, but before she could begin reading, Sigrid stepped forward with a request that surprised everyone present. "Before you read that letter, Lady Astrid, might I ask you to first show us the Raven message that brought it? Every important communication arrives with specific markings that identify its origin and route. Surely a message of such significance would bear the proper seals and authenticating marks." The request was so reasonable, so obviously the product of genuine knowledge about how such communications were handled, that several guests nodded their approval. It was exactly the sort of detail that a real member of the nobility would know, but that a trained impostor might overlook. Astrid's hesitation was brief but telling. That the Raven band was damaged in flight. The message arrived without its usual markings. "How unfortunate," Sigrid replied calmly. "Perhaps then we might examine the parchment itself. Different regions use different methods of preparing their writing materials. An expert eye can often identify the origin of a document by its texture, watermarks, and the particular blend of inks used." This suggestion clearly made Astrid uncomfortable, and she clutched the letter more tightly. "This is absurd. We are wasting time on trivial details while ignoring the substance of serious accusations." But Jarl Einar, despite his weakness from the recent poisoning attempt, was beginning to assert his authority once more. "Wife," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command, "in a matter of such importance, no detail is trivial. If you have evidence that bears on this girl's identity and intentions, then that evidence must be examined as carefully as any other." The confrontation was building toward a critical moment, but it was interrupted by an unexpected development. One of the hall servants approached the high table with obvious nervousness, carrying a bundle wrapped in rough cloth. "Forgive the interruption, my lord," the servant said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But in cleaning Lady Astrid's chambers earlier today, I found this hidden beneath her bed. I thought, given the seriousness of tonight's discussions, that you should see it." The bundle, when unwrapped, revealed a collection of items that made several guests gasp in recognition and horror. There were small vials of various poisons, carefully labeled and organized. There were forged documents bearing false seals. And most damning of all, there was a detailed plan written in Astrid's own hand, outlining a scheme to eliminate potential threats to her son's inheritance. The plan was methodical and chilling in its scope. It detailed not only the gradual poisoning of Jarl Einar, but also contingencies for dealing with any potential claimants to the family's power. Most shocking of all, it included a section dedicated to preventing Valdis from ever returning home. Should she somehow have survived her supposed death, this document, the servant said, his voice shaking with the enormity of what he was revealing, contains details about the messenger Valdis sent 20 years ago, the one who supposedly never arrived. According to these notes, Lady Astrid intercepted and killed the messenger herself, ensuring that news of Valdis's survival and her child never reached the Jarl's ears. The revelation was the final piece of a puzzle that revealed the true scope of Astrid's machinations. She had not simply been trying to protect her son's inheritance. She had been systematically eliminating anyone who might threaten her own position as the power behind the throne. Astrid's face had gone white as fresh snow, and her hands trembled as she realized that her carefully constructed web of lies and accusations was unraveling beyond any hope of repair. But even cornered, she retained enough cunning to attempt one final desperate gambit. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice rising to near hysteria. "All lies. That servant has been bought by our enemies. Those documents are forgeries planted to destroy me." But her protests rang hollow in the face of the mounting evidence. The handwriting in the documents was clearly hers, and the details they contained could only have been known by someone intimately involved in the crimes they described. It was then that Thorbjorn made a decision that would finally lay all secrets bare. Moving to the great fire that dominated the hall, he knelt and began to carefully move aside the burning logs, revealing something that had been hidden in the depths of the hearth. "When Valdis died," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of memory, "she asked me to save one thing above all others, the burial shroud she had woven for herself during her final months. She said it would serve as proof of her identity when the time came for truth to be spoken. What he withdrew from the hidden cache was a length of cloth that took the breath away from everyone who saw it. The shroud was woven from the finest materials, but more importantly, it was worked with patterns and symbols that were unmistakably the product of Valdis's own hands. Every guest who had known the Jarl's daughter recognized her distinctive style, her particular way of incorporating runes and protective symbols into her needlework. "This shroud bears Valdis's personal marks," Thorbjorn announced, holding the cloth so that all could see. "But more than that, it bears bloodstains from the night of Sigrid's birth, proof that the girl we see before us is indeed the child born to Valdis in exile." The artifact was the final, irrefutable proof of Sigrid's identity. Combined with the revelation of Astrid's crimes and the mounting evidence of her deceptions, it created a picture so clear that even the most skeptical observer could no longer deny the truth. But the most profound moment came when Sigrid herself reached out to touch the shroud that her mother had woven for her own burial. As her fingers made contact with the ancient cloth, tears began to flow down her cheeks, not tears of sorrow, but tears of connection to a mother she had never known, but who had loved her enough to ensure that proof of their bond would survive across 20 years of separation. "Mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "I wish you could have lived to see this moment." The emotional power of that simple statement, combined with the overwhelming evidence of truth, finally broke the last resistance to accepting Sigrid as Valdis's daughter and Jarl, Einar's rightful granddaughter. The moment when Sigrid touched her mother's burial shroud seemed to break something fundamental in Astrid's composure. The careful mask of righteousness and injured innocence that she had worn throughout the evening finally cracked, revealing the desperate fury of a woman whose carefully laid plans were crumbling beyond any hope of salvation. "No!" she screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that made several guests step backward in alarm. "I will not allow this charade to continue. I will not see everything I have worked for, everything I have sacrificed for, destroyed by some bastard girl and her lies." She lunged toward the high table, where Jarl Einar's ceremonial crown rested among the other symbols of authority. The crown was more than mere decoration. It represented the leadership of the clan, the right to make decisions that could affect the lives of hundreds of people. In Astrid's twisted logic, if she could claim that symbol, she might yet salvage something from the wreckage of her schemes. But Thorbjorn was faster than his size would suggest. The giant warrior moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent decades in combat, intercepting Astrid before she could reach the crown. His massive hands closed gently but firmly around her wrists, restraining her without causing harm. "It is over, Lady Astrid," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weary sadness of a man who had seen too much treachery and betrayal. "The truth has been spoken. Your crimes have been revealed. There is no path forward that leads anywhere but justice." Astrid struggled against his grip like a trapped animal, her green eyes blazing with a hatred that shocked even those who thought they knew her well. "You don't understand," she snarled, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You don't understand what it means to watch everything you've built slip away. Everything I did to protect my sons, to secure their future. That girl threatens everything. That girl, Jarl Einar said, his voice growing stronger as the immediate effects of the recent poisoning attempt began to fade, is my granddaughter. She is family, and family does not threaten, it strengthens. The old Jarl had risen from his chair, and despite his recent weakness, he carried himself with the dignity and authority that had marked his leadership for decades. His pale blue eyes, so similar to Sigrid's own, fixed on his wife with a mixture of grief and steely determination. Astrid, he continued, his voice heavy with the weight of 25 years of marriage, now revealed to be built on deception. I trusted you with my life, my family, my very soul, and you repaid that trust by slowly murdering me while eliminating anyone who might threaten your position. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around the hall, guests who had known Astrid for years struggled to reconcile the woman. They thought they knew with the calculating criminal who had been revealed tonight. But it was Ragnar and Olaf's reactions that proved most significant in that crucial moment. The two young men had stood frozen throughout the revelations, watching their mother's crimes unfold with expressions of growing horror and disbelief. Now, faced with undeniable evidence of her guilt and the choice between supporting her desperate last stand or acknowledging the truth, they made a decision that would define their characters for the rest of their lives. Mother, Ragnar said, his voice breaking with emotion, how could you? How could you do such things and never show the slightest sign of guilt or remorse? Olaf stepped forward to stand beside his brother, his face pale but determined. We cannot support this, he said quietly. We cannot stand with you against our own family, against our own sister. The word sister fell into the hall like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of acceptance and recognition. By acknowledging Sigrid as their sister, Ragnar and Olaf were not only rejecting their mother's crimes but embracing the new reality that her revelations had created. Astrid's face contorted with rage and betrayal as she realized that even her own sons were turning against her.
Fools, she spat.
Weak, soft-hearted fools. She will steal everything from you, your inheritance, your position, your very identity, and you welcome her with open arms because she sheds a few pretty tears. But her words no longer carried any power to persuade. The evidence of her crimes was too overwhelming, her guilt too clear and her motivations too transparently selfish for anyone to take her accusations seriously. It was Sigrid herself who provided the moment of grace that would be remembered long after the details of accusation and evidence had faded from memory. Stepping forward despite the continued tension in the hall, she addressed Astrid directly with a voice that carried no hatred or desire for revenge. Lady Astrid, she said quietly, I am sorry that my existence has caused you such fear and pain. I never sought to threaten your sons or your position. I only wanted to understand where I came from and who I truly am. She paused, looking around the hall at the faces of people who were beginning to accept her as family. But I will not let fear guide my actions as it has guided yours. If I am truly Jarl Einar's granddaughter, then I will use that position not to take from others, but to help heal the wounds that have divided our peoples for too long. The dignity and wisdom of her response, coming from someone so young and in such a chaotic situation, impressed even those who had been most skeptical of her claims. The gracious wisdom of Sigrid's response to Astrid's hatred seemed to unlock something in the assembled crowd, a collective recognition that they were witnessing not just the resolution of a family crisis, but the emergence of a leader who might indeed bridge the ancient divisions that had shaped their world. Magnus, the battle-scarred warrior, was the first to step forward, his weathered face bearing an expression of respect that would have been unthinkable hours earlier, when Sigrid was merely an unknown girl standing beside Thorbjorn. I have fought against the wolf clan for more years than I care to count, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. I have buried sons and brothers in that endless war. If this young woman truly carries the blood of both our houses, if she represents a chance for peace, Then she has my support, whatever the cost to old grudges and older pride. His declaration seemed to break a dam of uncertainty. Other voices began to join his, sharing their own losses to the long feud and their hope that Sigrid might represent an end to the cycle of violence that had defined their lives. My daughter was widowed in a wolf clan raid 5 years ago, called out one woman. She has raised her children alone ever since. If there is a chance for peace, a chance that other young wives might not suffer as she has, then I stand with the Jarl's granddaughter. And I, added an elderly man whose scars spoke of decades of warfare. I am tired of training boys to die before they become men. If this girl can give us peace, then she's worth more than all the gold in our treasuries. The tide of support was overwhelming, but Astrid was not yet prepared to surrender. With the desperate cunning of a cornered animal, she broke free from Thorbjorn's restraining. Grip and snatch something from the serving table, a carving knife, used for the feast's preparation. If I cannot preserve what is rightfully my son's, she snarled, raising the blade toward Sigrid, then I will ensure that this pretender never lives to steal it. The attack was swift and vicious, driven by years of accumulated resentment and the desperate fury of a woman who saw her entire world crumbling. But Astrid had underestimated both the loyalty she faced and the courage of the girl she sought to destroy. Sigrid did not flee or cower. Instead, she stepped forward to meet the attack, her movements showing the same unconscious grace that had marked her throughout the evening. More importantly, she was not alone. Ragnar and Olaf moved to flank her, their own weapons drawn to defend their newfound sister. Thorbjorn positioned himself to block any escape route, while Jarl Einar, despite his recent weakness, rose to his full height with the authority of a man whose word was law. Enough, the old Jarl commanded, his voice carrying the power that had led men into battle for decades. Astrid, put down that blade. You have brought enough shame to this house. Do not add the murder of an innocent girl to your list of crimes, but perhaps the most significant intervention came from an unexpected source. From among the assembled guests, a figure emerged who had remained silent throughout the evenings. Revelations, a traveling merchant whose weathered cloak and simple appearance had made him nearly invisible. Among the nobles and warriors, now as he threw back his hood, gasps arose from throughout the hall. The man bore the distinctive features of the Wolf clan, and the silver armband on his wrist marked him as a messenger of high rank. I am Bjorn Eriksson, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of official communication. I bring word from Erik Gunnarsson of the Wolf clan, who has waited 20 years for this moment. The revelation that a Wolf clan messenger had been present throughout the evening's events added another layer of significance to everything that had transpired. This was not merely a family reunion, but a diplomatic moment that could reshape the political landscape of the entire region. Bjorn reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a ceremonial bowl. Its silver surface worked with intricate patterns that combined the symbols of both clans. My Lord Erik sends this as a gift to his daughter, should she choose to acknowledge her heritage from both her parents' houses. It is a unity bowl, crafted specifically for the joining of divided peoples. The artifact was beautiful in its symbolism, a vessel that could hold offerings from both clans, a physical representation of the peace that Sigrid's very existence might make possible. Faced with this overwhelming demonstration of acceptance and hope, Astrid's desperate attack faltered. The knife trembled in her hand as she looked around the hall at faces that no longer showed fear or uncertainty, but determination and unity. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of her defeat. I only wanted to protect what was ours. I only wanted to ensure my son's future. And instead, Jarl Einar said sadly, you have ensured your own exile. The crimes you have committed, the murders, the poisoning, the deception, cannot be forgiven or forgotten. You must leave this hall and never return. The sentence was delivered with the finality of absolute judgment, and even Astrid seemed to recognize that her time was truly over. 6 months had passed since that transformative night when truth shattered the careful silence of 20 years, and the great longhouse of Jarl Einar once again hosted a feast of momentous importance. But this gathering was unlike any that had come before. Representatives from both the Raven clan and the Wolf clan sat side by side at tables that had once known only separation and suspicion. The hall itself seemed transformed by the occasion. Where banners had once displayed only the symbols of a single house, now the ravens and wolves were intertwined in patterns that spoke of unity rather than conquest. The very air hummed with conversation that would have been unthinkable mere months before. Warriors sharing stories across old battle lines, mothers discussing their children's futures without the shadow of inevitable war, elders speaking of trade routes and mutual prosperity rather than raid strategies and defensive preparations. At the high table, Jarl Einar sat with strength restored and purpose renewed. The months of gradual recovery from Astrid's poison had been difficult, but they had also been healing in ways that went beyond the merely physical. The revelation of his granddaughter's existence had given him a reason to rebuild, not just his health, but his hope for the future. Beside him sat Sigrid, no longer the unknown girl whose presence had once been questioned, but a young woman whose wisdom and grace had impressed even the most skeptical observers. She wore a dress of fine blue wool, fastened with the silver brooches that marked her status as acknowledged heir to the Jarl's line. But more than her clothing, it was the quiet confidence in her bearing that marked her transformation from exile to recognized nobility. The months had not been easy for her. Learning to navigate the complex politics of clan leadership while maintaining the integrity that had marked her character required constant vigilance and careful judgment. But she had proven herself worthy of the trust placed in her, mediating disputes with fairness and wisdom that belied her years. Ragnar and Olaf flanked their sister with protective pride, their initial shock at her existence having transformed into genuine affection and respect. The brothers had struggled with the implications of their mother's crimes and their own complicity in perpetuating old hatreds. But they had emerged from that struggle as better men, leaders who understood that true strength came from justice rather than dominance. I never imagined I would see the day when Wolf clan warriors would feast in our hall without weapons drawn, Ragnar murmured to his sister, watching as men who had once been mortal enemies shared mead and stories around the great fire. Nor did I dream that peace could feel so natural once we allowed ourselves to try it, Olaf added, his tone reflecting the wonder that many felt at how quickly old animosities could fade when replaced by mutual benefit and respect. But perhaps the most significant presence at the feast was that of Eric Gunnarsson himself. Sigrid's father had arrived 3 days earlier with a small retinue, his first visit to the Raven clan's territory in over 20 years. The meeting between father and daughter had been emotional and profound. Two people who shared blood and heritage, finally able to acknowledge their relationship openly. Eric was a man in his late 40s, his hair beginning to show silver at the temples, but his bearing still strong and proud. The years had carved lines of grief around his eyes, grief for Valdis, for the daughter he had never been able to claim, for the countless young men who had died in the meaningless conflict between their peoples. But those same years had also given him the wisdom to recognize that Sigrid represented redemption for all those losses. "My daughter," he had said during their first private conversation, "you have accomplished what your mother and I could only dream of. You have made peace, not through conquest or submission, but through the simple power of truth and courage." Now, as the feast reached its ceremonial climax, Eric rose from his place at the high table to address the assembled guests. His voice carried clearly across the hall, reaching every corner where representatives of both clans waited to hear words that would formally end 3 decades of warfare. "Friends," he began, the simple word carrying extraordinary weight when spoken by a man who had once been considered the greatest enemy of everyone present. "We gather tonight not to celebrate victory or mourn defeat, but to acknowledge something far more precious, the end of a conflict that has cost us all too much. He gestured toward the elaborate document that lay upon the table before him, its parchment covered with the careful script of trained scribes and bearing the seals of both clan leaders. This treaty represents more than political agreement. It represents the triumph of hope over hatred, of wisdom over warfare, of love over the fear that has divided our peoples for far too long. The treaty itself was a masterwork of diplomatic craftsmanship, carefully negotiating the complex details of trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and mutual defense pacts. But its true power lay not in its specific provisions, but in its symbolic significance. Two peoples choosing to build a future together, rather than remaining trapped in the mistakes of the past. But most importantly, Eric continued, his eyes finding Sigrid among the assembled dignitaries, this treaty exists because one young woman had the courage to claim her heritage from both our houses and use it to heal wounds that many thought would never close. The applause that followed was heartfelt and prolonged, but Sigrid's response was characteristically gracious and humble. Rising from her seat, she addressed the assembly with the poise that had marked her emergence as a leader. "I am grateful beyond words for the acceptance and trust you have shown me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. "But the peace we celebrate tonight was not achieved by any one person. It exists because all of us, Raven and Wolf alike, chose to value the future more than the past. Chose to build rather than destroy." She paused, looking around the hall at faces that reflected hope rather than the suspicion and fear that had once defined relations between the clans. "My mother dreamed of this moment, and my father hoped for it. But it has become reality because each of you was willing to take the risk that peace requires, the risk of trusting former enemies, to become future friends." As the evening drew to its close, and the formal ceremonies gave way to more personal conversations, Thorbjorn found himself standing once again in his familiar position near the great doors. But now, instead of guarding secrets, he was witnessing their fulfillment. The burden he had carried for 20 years had been transformed into joy, and the girl he had protected in silence had become the bridge her parents had died hoping she might be. The great hall echoed with laughter and conversation that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. Former enemies were making plans for joint trading expeditions. Young people from both clans were discovering friendships that might bloom into something deeper. Children who had been raised on stories of perpetual warfare were hearing instead tales of cooperation and mutual prosperity, and at the center of it all sat Sigrid, no longer the unknown girl whose very presence had once been questioned, but the acknowledged heir who had proven that belonging was not about bloodlines alone, but about the courage to claim one's place in the world and use it to make that world better for everyone.